The tea was stone cold by the time I heard the front door click shut. My husband, Arthur, had been gone exactly 48 hours. The house still smelled of his expensive cedarwood aftershave and the faint, antiseptic tang of the hospice equipment they had hauled away that morning. I was sitting in his leather wingback chair, the one that faced the garden, when I heard the sound of a key turning, a key I hadn't realized my daughter, Cassandra, still possessed. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She walked into the living room with the brisk, caffeinated energy of a woman who had a schedule to keep. She didn't look at the urn on the mantel. She didn't look at my swollen eyes. She looked at the mahogany desk where Arthur kept his ledgers. She smoothed her silk skirt, sat on the edge of the sofa, and told me that since I was clearly overwhelmed and heading into my twilight years, it was time to discuss the management of the $25 million Arthur had built from the dirt of his father's farm. She said the word management like she was teaching a child how to tie her shoes. She told me she had already spoken to a consultant about moving the funds into a trust she would oversee to save me the burden of the paperwork. I didn't say a word. I just watched a single bead of condensation drip down the side of my forgotten teacup. It was the moment I realized my daughter wasn't mourning a father. She was auditing an estate. Grief is a heavy veil, but it is also a transparent one. I am a woman who understands the architecture of a dollar because I remember when we didn't have a cent to spare. Before Arthur's logistics empire took flight, I spent 20 years as a head nurse in a trauma ward. I have seen the way people break, and more importantly, I have seen the way they try to hide the pieces. I didn't grow up with the luxury of entitlement. I grew up with the necessity of observation. People think that because I am a Black woman of a certain age, my silence is a sign of confusion or fading relevance. They see the silver in my hair and assume the gears behind my eyes have slowed down. They are mistaken. My silence isn't an absence of thought. It is a laboratory where I test your intentions. Arthur knew this. He was a man of immense wealth, but he was also a man of immense foresight. 2 days before he took his last breath, while the house was quiet and the nurses were changing shifts, he pulled me close. His voice was a thin, dry rasp like autumn leaves skittering across a driveway. He didn't tell me he loved me. We had said that every day for 45 years. He told me to open the floor safe. He told me to transfer every liquid asset, every account, and every deed into a private holding company he had established in my name only 3 months prior. He knew his children better than they knew themselves. He told me, "Evelyn, they will come for the harvest before the ground is even cold. Don't argue with them. Just move the fence." Cassandra kept talking, her voice rising and falling in that professional, practiced lilt she used when she wanted something. She mentioned my senior health, the volatility of the market, and how unprepared I was for this level of financial independence. She didn't know that 48 hours ago, I had sat at that very mahogany desk and executed the final transfers. She didn't know that the accounts she thought she was inheriting were already empty shells. She saw a grieving widow who needed a guardian. I saw a creditor who had forgotten who provided the loan. I let the silence stretch between us until it became a physical weight in the room. Silence is a mirror. If you wait long enough, people will always show you their true face in it. She eventually stopped talking, her brow furrowing when I didn't offer the expected protest. I simply stood up, adjusted the lace collar of my dress, and told her I would take her suggestion under advisement. I didn't tell her the money was already gone. I didn't tell her that the quiet power of a grandmother's wisdom is far more dangerous than the loud arrogance of a daughter's greed. This isn't just a story about family betrayal. It's a lesson in justice. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, or if you've watched someone you love try to scavenge your hard work before you're even gone, you need to see how this ends. This was the first move in a game Cassandra didn't even know we were playing. The karma of entitlement is a slow-acting poison, and I was about to let her take a very deep drink. Cassandra left that afternoon with a smirk that she thought was hidden behind a mask of filial concern. She patted my hand, a condescending, rhythmic tapping, and told me she'd have the transition papers sent over by Monday. She walked out of my house, as if she already owned the floorboards beneath her feet. I watched her sleek silver SUV pull out of the driveway, the tires crunching on the gravel Arthur had handpicked from the quarry 30 years ago. She didn't look back at the windows. She didn't see me standing there, a woman she had already categorized as a relic. She had spent 40 years being my daughter, but she hadn't spent a single day truly knowing me. She saw a mother who baked pound cakes and reminded her to wear a coat. She never saw the woman who managed a surgical floor under the pressure of a citywide blackout. She forgot that I am a woman of structure, and structure does not bend for the sake of sentiment. I walked back into Arthur's study. The silence in the room was no longer heavy with grief. It was sharp with purpose. I sat in his chair and opened the ledger. Most people think $25 million is a mountain of gold coins, but at this level, money is just a series of permissions and barriers. It is a language of yes and no. My daughter and her husband, Marcus, had been living on a yes for a very long time. They had a mortgage on a house in the hills that Arthur quietly subsidized. They had car leases that ran through the company accounts. They had private school tuitions for my grandchildren that were paid directly from a family educational trust. For years, I had been the one to sign the checks while Arthur handled the vision. I knew their overhead. I knew their burn rate. I knew that without the steady drip of Arthur's generosity, their entire life was a house of cards built on a windy cliff. They thought they were the architects of their success, but they were merely the tenants of our hard work. Setting boundaries with family isn't about slamming doors. It's about changing the locks while they're out at dinner. I spent the evening reviewing the automated distributions. I saw the upcoming payment for Marcus's country club membership. I saw the quarterly wire transfer for Cassandra's consultancy firm, a business that had never turned a profit, but served as a prestigious hobby for her. I felt no anger. Anger is a leak in the engine of justice. I felt the cold, clinical detachment of a nurse prepping a field for surgery. You cannot heal a wound until you debride the necrotic tissue. I realized then that my daughter didn't just want the money. She wanted the power to manage me. She wanted to turn her mother into a line item. She assumed that because I was grieving, I was also gasping for air. She didn't realize that in the deep end of the ocean, I am the one who knows how to breathe. I reached out to our longtime family attorney, Solomon Reed. Solomon had been with us since the days we were living in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. He knew the grit it took to build this legacy. When I called him, I didn't cry. I didn't complain about Cassandra's disrespect. I simply told him that the fence Arthur spoke of had been moved. I told him to initiate the quiet period protocol Arthur and I had discussed months ago. This protocol was a failsafe. It meant that all discretionary spending from the secondary trusts was to be frozen for a probate review period of 90 days. It was perfectly legal, perfectly standard, and absolutely devastating for someone who lived paycheck to paycheck on a millionaire's budget. I wasn't cutting them off out of spite. I was simply returning them to the reality they had so conveniently forgotten. That night, I slept in the center of the bed I had shared with Arthur for decades. I didn't feel lonely. I felt accompanied by the weight of our shared secret. As I drifted off, I thought about the phone call I would get on Monday morning. I thought about the moment the silver SUV would run out of gas, and find that the company card was temporarily declined. This is the part of the story where people think the mean old woman is being cruel. But quiet power is about teaching people the value of what they take for granted. If you think you can manage my life, you should first demonstrate that you can manage your own without my husband's ghost signing the checks. The first crack in their foundation was about to appear, and I wouldn't be the one to pick up the hammer. I was just going to stop holding up the roof. The silence of a Monday morning in a house that used to be full of life is a specific kind of quiet. It isn't empty, it's expectant. I sat in the breakfast nook with a single piece of dry toast and a glass of water, watching the clock on the wall. At 9 a.m., the financial world opens its eyes. At 9:15 a.m., the first automated pings of the business week begin. And at 9:30 a.m., the first cracks in Cassandra's curated reality began to spiderweb across her phone screen. I didn't have to be there to see it. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere from 5 miles away. I had spent 40 years predicting the needs of patients before they could even vocalize them. Predicting my daughter's reaction was child's play. The first call came at 10:12 a.m. I let it ring. The second call came at 10:15 a.m. I let that one ring, too. There is a specific power in an unanswered phone. It forces the person on the other end to sit with their own panic. It strips away their ability to perform their outrage for an audience. I went about my morning deadheading the geraniums on the patio and wiping down the baseboards. I have always found that when the world gets loud, the best response is to make your immediate surroundings very, very clean. By the time I finally picked up the house phone, not my cell, but the landline Arthur insisted on keeping, Cassandra's voice was no longer the polished, professional instrument she had used on Saturday. It was frayed at the edges. She told me there had been a glitch. She said her corporate card had been declined at the morning briefing for her firm's new rebranding campaign. She said Marcus had called her from the dealership, where he was supposed to pick up his new luxury sedan, only to be told the wire transfer hadn't cleared. She used the word embarrassing 3 times in 60 seconds. She spoke as if a natural disaster had struck, something unpredictable and cruel. I listened to the sound of her breathing, shallow, jagged, the sound of someone who has realized the floor isn't as solid as they thought. I waited. I let the silence do the heavy lifting. When she finally stopped to ask if I knew anything about a probate review, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. I told her, in the same tone I used to comfort a nervous patient before and for insertion, that Arthur's estate was complex. I explained that the quiet period was a standard security measure to ensure every cent was accounted for before the final distribution. I told her that Solomon Reed was simply following the letter of the law to protect the legacy. I didn't tell her that I was the one who had defined what protecting the legacy meant. She began to argue, her voice rising in that entitled register that implies the world owes her a comfortable seat. She spoke about her obligations and her reputation. She didn't mention her father once. She didn't ask how I was sleeping. She didn't ask if I needed help with the funeral arrangements that were still pending. She only asked when the glitch would be fixed. I realized then that Cassandra didn't see me as a person. She saw me as a vault that had suddenly changed its combination. To her, my only function was to facilitate her lifestyle. This is the danger of providing too much shade for a plant. It never learns how to find its own sun, and it resents the tree for eventually losing its leaves. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply told her that these things take time, and that perhaps she should look into her own personal savings to cover her immediate embarrassments. The silence that followed that suggestion was the loudest thing I had heard all morning. She knew, and I knew, that her personal savings were non-existent. She had spent every dime of her allowance on the appearance of wealth, never realizing that true wealth is the ability to say no, and mean it. As I hung up the phone, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Family betrayal isn't always a knife in the back. Sometimes it's just a hand in your pocket while you're trying to bury your dead. She thought she was the one setting boundaries by trying to take control of the $25 million. She didn't realize that I had already moved the boundary line 10 miles behind me. I wasn't just standing up for myself. I was reclaiming the dignity that Arthur and I had bled for. The quiet power of an older woman is that we don't need to shout to be heard. We just need to stop whispering the answers to people who aren't listening. Tuesday arrived with a different kind of noise. If Monday was the shock of the cold water, Tuesday was the shivering that follows. I spent the morning in the kitchen, slowly polishing the silver. It is a meditative task, the rhythmic circular motion of the cloth bringing a dull glow back to things that have been neglected. Silver doesn't stay bright on its own. It requires maintenance, much like a reputation. While I worked, I thought about the phone calls I hadn't returned. Marcus, my son-in-law, had left 3 voicemails. His voice was deeper than Cassandra's, layered with a forced bravado that cracked by the 3rd message. He spoke about liquidity issues and short-term bridge loans, as if he were a captain of industry and not a man whose entire lifestyle was a gift-wrapped inheritance he hadn't earned. I didn't call him back. I didn't have to. When you have spent decades watching people, you know exactly where their pressure points are. Marcus's pressure point was his ego. He needed the country club, the premium leather seats, and the nod of approval from men who actually built things. He didn't realize that Arthur and I had been the silent scaffolding holding up his stage. I looked at the silver cream pitcher in my hand and remembered the day we bought it. We were celebrating our first million. Arthur had looked at me and said, "Evelyn, the money is a tool, not a destination. The moment you treat it like a destination, you lose the map." Cassandra and Marcus had lost the map a long time ago. They were wandering in a forest of their own desires, thinking the trees belonged to them because they liked the shade. By noon, the doorbell rang. I didn't hurry. I finished the spoon I was polishing, rinsed my hands, and dried them thoroughly. I opened the door to find Marcus standing there, looking rumpled in a way I had never seen. His silk tie was slightly crooked, and there was a frantic glint in his eyes. He didn't offer a greeting or a word of condolence for the man who had treated him like a son for 15 years. He stepped into the foyer and started talking about the educational trust. He said the private school had called because the tuition check for my grandson, Leo, had been returned. He said it was traumatizing for the boy. He blamed the bank. He blamed the probate review. He looked at me, waiting for me to gasp in horror and write a personal check to fix the mistake. I didn't gasp. I didn't reach for my purse. I stood in the foyer of the home I had built and looked him directly in the eye. I told him that I was sure Leo was resilient. I told him that perhaps this was an opportunity for them to look into the public school system, which I had attended, or perhaps to dip into the rainy day fund he had surely established with his 6-figure salary. The look on his face was a revelation. It wasn't just anger, it was a profound, childish confusion. He truly believed that the $25 million was a communal pot that he had an inherent right to stir. He didn't see the sacrifice. He didn't see the nights Arthur spent sweating over logistics contracts or the years I spent working double shifts to keep our initial investments afloat. He only saw the harvest. Setting boundaries with entitled relatives is a quiet process. It is the act of saying no without providing a paragraph of justification. When you justify your boundaries, you give the other person room to negotiate. I had nothing to negotiate. The money was safe, the fence was moved, and the quiet period was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was stripping away the illusions. Marcus tried to pivot. He tried to act as if he were concerned about my grasp on the situation. He hinted that Grief might be clouding my judgment. He suggested that maybe I shouldn't be making major financial decisions so soon after Arthur's passing. He was trying to gaslight a woman who had spent 40 years distinguishing between a heartbeat and a murmur. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told him that my judgment had never been clearer. I told him that since he was so concerned about my well-being, he should probably head home and focus on his own finances, so I wouldn't have to worry about him. I opened the door and waited. The silence of the hallway was a wall he couldn't climb. He left, fuming, his heels clicking sharply on the stone steps. As I closed the door, I realized that they still thought this was a temporary inconvenience. They thought if they pushed hard enough, the old woman would break. They didn't realize that I wasn't breaking. I was finally letting go of the weight of their expectations. The structure was holding. The consequences were beginning to manifest. And for the first time in 48 hours, I sat down and enjoyed a hot cup of tea. Wednesday arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that makes you want to sit perfectly still. I spent the morning in Arthur's greenhouse, pruning the orchids. They are temperamental things, too much water, and they rot too little, and they wither. They require a balanced environment, much like a family, for decades. I had been the one providing the climate control, adjusting the temperature, so everyone else could bloom. But as I snipped a dead leaf from a cattleya, I realized that my children hadn't become flowers, they had become parasites. They didn't know how to photosynthesize their own success. They only knew how to drain the host. The afternoon brought a visitor I hadn't expected so soon, my son, David. Unlike Cassandra, David was the quiet one. He didn't demand, he suggested. He didn't shout, he sighed. He arrived with a bouquet of lilies, Arthur's favorite, and a look of practiced sorrow that didn't quite reach his eyes. He sat in the kitchen and drank the coffee I poured for him, talking about legacy and stewardship. He didn't mention the $25 million directly. He talked about a charitable foundation he wanted to start in Arthur's name, a foundation that would conveniently require a $5 million endowment and a hefty salary for its executive director. Himself. He told me he wanted to honor the old man. He spoke about the spiritual weight of such a large inheritance and how it could corrupt the family if not handled with enlightened oversight. He was using the language of a philosopher to mask the hands of a pickpocket. I watched him across the table, the steam from his coffee rising between us like a physical barrier. I thought about the time David was 12 and stole $50 from my purse to buy video games, then cried and told me he had lost it at the park. He hadn't changed. He had just traded video games for foundations and tears for spiritual weight. I let him finish his entire presentation. I let the silence settle in the kitchen, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator. I didn't tell him his idea was transparent. I didn't tell him I knew about his gambling debts in Atlantic City, debts Arthur had quietly cleared 3 years ago on the condition that it never happen again. I simply asked him one question. David, if the money were gone tomorrow, how would you honor your father then? The look on his face was a portrait of a man who had never considered a world without a safety net. He stammered something about practicality and the tools of the trade. He couldn't answer the question because to him, the man was the money. Family betrayal often looks like concern. It looks like people trying to save you from yourself when they are actually trying to save their own lifestyle. David thought that by playing the good son, he would be the one I chose to hold the keys. He didn't realize that I had already changed the locks and buried the keys in a place he would never think to look, in work and discipline, and in a holding company he couldn't touch. I told him I would pray on it. It is a phrase that older Black women have used for generations to mean, I have already decided. And the answer is no, but I'm going to let God take the blame for your disappointment. He left with his lilies and his enlightened oversight, leaving me alone in the quiet house once more. I walked through the rooms, touching the furniture, the photos, the memories. This house was a fortress built on 45 years of partnership. Arthur and I had started with nothing but a shared dream and a work ethic that didn't understand the concept of a weekend. We had earned our senior justice. We had earned the right to decide who was worthy of the harvest. I realized then that my children weren't mourning a father. They were mourning a bank. And a bank that is closed for probate review is a very cold place to seek warmth. The quiet period was working. The predators were circling, but they were finding the gates locked and the lights off. I wasn't just setting boundaries. I was performing an audit of their souls. And so far, every one of them was coming up short. I sat back down in Arthur's chair, closed my eyes, and listened to the silence. It was the sound of a storm breaking, and for the first time in a long time, I knew I was the one who controlled the wind. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy, gray sky that promised rain, but delivered only heat. I was in the dining room, moving the heavy silver candelabras to the sideboard, when I saw the procession of cars pulling into the circular drive. It wasn't just Cassandra this time. It wasn't just Marcus or David. It was the entire assembly of the entitled. They had coordinated. They had strategized. They had decided that since their individual attempts to pick the lock had failed, they would simply kick down the door. They walked up the front steps as a phalanx of tailored wool and expensive leather. I didn't move to open the door until the third chime of the bell. I let them stand in the humidity, feeling the weight of the air, before I finally turned the handle. They filed into my living room like a hostile corporate takeover. Cassandra took the lead, her face a mask of practiced intervention concern. Marcus stood by the fireplace, trying to look imposing, while David hovered near the drinks trolley, his eyes darting toward the whiskey decanter. They had brought a fourth person, a young man in a sharp blue suit with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Cassandra introduced him as Mr. Henderson, a specialist in elderly asset protection and cognitive transition. The insult was so thinly veiled, it was practically transparent. They weren't even pretending to mourn anymore. They were here to perform a clinical assessment of my competence. I sat in my chair, the one Arthur bought me when we moved in, and folded my hands in my lap. I didn't offer them refreshments. I didn't offer them a seat. I simply waited. Silence is a vacuum. If you don't fill it, your enemies will eventually suffocate in it. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat and began a prepared speech about the complexities of managing a $25 million portfolio at an advanced age. He spoke about the emotional toll of widowhood and how it can impair long-term strategic thinking. He used words like fiduciary, conservatorship, and stability. He spoke to me as if I were a flickering candle in a drafty room. I didn't blink. I didn't interrupt. I just watched the way his hands shook slightly as he realized I wasn't reacting the way the textbook said I would. Cassandra stepped in when the lawyer faltered. She leaned forward, her voice dropping into a register of false intimacy. She told me they were doing this because they loved me. She said they wanted to ensure Arthur's legacy wasn't squandered during this period of confusion. She mentioned the utility bills that hadn't been paid, bills I had intentionally diverted to the probate review pile, as evidence of my slipping. She was building a case out of shadows and dust. I looked at David, the good son, who nodded solemnly as if he were witnessing a tragedy. He was already spending the $5 million in his head, picking out the mahogany for his foundation's boardroom. I waited until Cassandra ran out of breath. I waited until the room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking in the hallway. Then I stood up. I didn't use the arms of the chair for leverage. I stood with the straight spine of a woman who had spent 30 years lifting patients off gurneys. I walked over to the desk, picked up a single manila folder and handed it to Mr. Henderson. Inside was not a medical record or a confession of confusion. It was a comprehensive 30-page audit of every cent Arthur and I had gifted to my children over the last decade. It listed the loans that were never repaid, the business investments that disappeared into thin air, and the emergency expenses that somehow always coincided with a new Mediterranean cruise. I told them, my voice as calm as a frozen lake, that if we were going to discuss asset protection, we should start with the people who had been the greatest threat to those assets for 20 years. I explained that the cognitive transition they were so worried about had already happened. I had transitioned from being their benefactor to being their landlord. I told Mr. Henderson that his services were no longer required, and that if he didn't leave my house in 30 seconds, I would call the police and report a group of trespassers attempting to harass a grieving widow. The lawyer looked at the audit, looked at the fire in my eyes, and didn't even wait for Cassandra to speak. He gathered his portfolio and walked out. The silence that followed his exit was the most satisfying sound I have ever heard. My children stood there, stripped of their professional cover, looking like the panicked scavengers they were. They realized that I wasn't the one who was confused. They were the ones who had miscalculated the strength of the foundation they were standing on. I told them that the quiet period was now an indefinite review. I told them that if they wanted to see a single cent of Arthur's legacy, they would have to earn it the same way we did, with discipline, structure, and a complete absence of entitlement. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply pointed toward the door. They left, but the war wasn't over. It had just moved from the living room to the boardroom. If you've ever had family try to use your age as a weapon against you, you know that senior justice isn't about being mean, it's about being immovable. They thought they could manage me. Now, they were about to find out what happens when the manager decides to close the business. Friday morning brought a cold rain that washed the dust off the porch, but couldn't touch the grime of yesterday's confrontation. I spent the early hours in Arthur's library not looking at the leather-bound classics, but at the digital records on his laptop. To my children, this machine was a mystery. To me, it was a map. I navigated the spreadsheets with the same precision I used to calculate medication dosages. In the ICU, when you deal with $25 million, you aren't just looking at numbers. You are looking at behavior. Every wire transfer to Marcus was a story of a failed ego. Every emergency deposit to Cassandra was a tale of a woman who preferred the appearance of success over the substance of it. I spent 3 hours meticulously deconstructing their access. It was quiet work, methodical. It felt like untying a series of knots that had been tightening around my neck for years. I realized that for a long time, Arthur and I had been enablers in the name of love. We thought we were providing a floor for them to stand on, but we had accidentally provided a ceiling that prevented them from growing up. Cutting people off isn't an act of cruelty. Sometimes it's the only way to save them from their own vacuum. I felt a strange, hollow peace as I revoked the authorized signer status on the secondary operating accounts. I wasn't just setting boundaries. I was performing a structural renovation of my life. By 2 p.m., the notifications began. I didn't have to check my phone to know that the automated emails were hitting their inboxes. I sat at the kitchen table, peeling an orange, watching the rain strike the glass. There is a specific kind of power in being the source of someone's comfort and then simply stopping. It's not about the money. It's about the realization that their sense of security was never theirs to begin with. It was borrowed, and the lender had just called in the debt. I thought about the standalone quote I'd heard once. True power isn't in how much you can give, but in how much you can refuse to provide without losing your peace. The doorbell didn't ring this time. Instead, the phone began to vibrate against the wood of the table. It was David. I let it vibrate until it stopped, Then I picked it up to read the text. It wasn't about the foundation anymore. It wasn't about spiritual weight. It was a desperate plea for a short-term loan because his mortgage was in arrears. He had been using the family trust to pay for a life he couldn't afford, and now that the quiet period had frozen the trust, his bank was coming for his house. He didn't ask how the funeral preparations were going. He didn't ask if I needed someone to sit with me in the dark. He asked for a wire transfer. I didn't reply. I put the phone in the kitchen drawer and closed it. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was clean. For 30 years, I had responded to every crisis my children manufactured. I had been the shock absorber for their poor decisions. But grief changes the chemistry of your soul. It makes you realize that you have a limited amount of breath left, and you can't keep using it to blow air into someone else's leaking balloon. I went to the window and watched a small bird huddle under the eave of the garage. It didn't have a trust fund or a logistics empire. It just had its own wings and the sense to stay out of the rain, setting boundaries with toxic family. Even if I refused to use that word, their behavior spoke for itself, is a form of senior justice that most people are too afraid to exert. They fear the disrespect of the younger generation. They fear being left alone. But I realized as I watched the rain that I was never less alone than when I was standing in my own truth. Arthur was gone, but his discipline lived on in me. The $25 million was no longer a burden. It was a wall. And for the first time in 48 hours, I realized that the wall wasn't just to keep them out. It was to keep me safe while I decided what the rest of my life was going to look like. I wasn't bitter. Bitterness is a slow-growing cancer that eats the host. I was simply finished. I was the head nurse again, and I had just called the time of death on their entitlement. The consequences were no longer theoretical. They were sitting in David's inbox and Cassandra's declined credit cards. I turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs. Tomorrow would be the funeral. Tomorrow, they would have to stand in front of the community and pretend to be the grieving heirs of a great man while knowing that the woman standing next to them held every card in the deck. The real test was coming, and I was the only one who had studied the map. The morning of Arthur's funeral was as sharp and clear as a diamond. I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, smoothing the fabric of my black silk suit. I didn't wear a veil. I wanted my eyes to be visible. I wanted my children to look at me and see exactly what was looking back at them. I had spent 48 years being the soft place where this family landed, but today I was the stone they were going to strike. As I pinned Arthur's favorite gold lapel pin to my jacket, I realized that family betrayal has a way of clarifying your vision. You stop seeing people as you want them to be, and start seeing them as they are. The church was filled with the smell of white lilies and the low murmur of the city's elite. Arthur's influence reached into every corner of this town, from the shipping docks to the mayor's office. My children were already there, staged at the front like actors in a play. Cassandra was draped in a designer morning dress that probably cost more than a nurse's monthly salary. Marcus was shaking hands with local politicians, his face set in a mask of somber importance. David stood by the casket, dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief. To the world, they were the grieving successors of a legacy. To me, they were creditors waiting for the bank to open. I walked down the aisle, the sound of my heels on the marble floors echoing in the sudden silence of the room. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at the man in the casket, the man who had worked himself into an early grave to ensure we never had to worry about a roof over our heads. When I reached the front row, I didn't sit down immediately. I stood for a moment, looking at my 3 children. The quiet period had been in effect for 5 days. I could see the strain behind their eyes. I could see the way Marcus's suit didn't quite hide the tension in his shoulders, or how Cassandra's hand shook as she adjusted her hat. They were terrified. They were standing in a room full of people who thought they were millionaires while knowing that their personal accounts were in the red. The service was a blur of platitudes and grandmother wisdom that didn't apply to the man Arthur actually was. When it was Cassandra's turn to speak, she stood at the pulpit and talked about generational wealth and the responsibility of carrying the torch. She spoke as if the money were already hers, a divine right passed down through blood. She didn't talk about Arthur's late nights or his calloused hands. She talked about the future. It was a pitch, not a eulogy. I sat there, my hands folded, feeling the quiet power of the documents sitting in my safe at home. She thought she was auditioning for the role of CEO. She didn't realize the company had already been dissolved and reformed in a way that left her on the outside looking in. After the service, at the reception in the church hall, the air was thick with the toxic scent of false sympathy. I stood in the center of the room, receiving condolences with a steady nod. Cassandra approached me, flanked by Marcus and David. They moved as a unit now, a desperate pack. Cassandra leaned in, her voice a sharp whisper beneath her breath. She told me that for the sake of the family's reputation, I needed to authorize a release of funds immediately. She said that if people found out the estate was frozen, it would look like I was incompetent or that Arthur had left us in ruin. She tried to use shame as a lever. She forgot that you cannot shame a woman who has nothing to hide. I looked at her, then at Marcus, then at David. I didn't lower my voice. I didn't raise it either. I told them that the only thing that would ruin the family's reputation was their own inability to live within their means. I told them that the funeral had been paid for by me personally because their contributions had never materialized. The silence that followed my words was a physical barrier. A few nearby mourners glanced our way, their curiosity piqued by the sudden tension. My children froze. They couldn't make a scene. Not here, not in front of the people they were trying so hard to impress. It was the ultimate checkmate. I walked away from them, leaving them standing in the middle of the hall, surrounded by the very people they were afraid of losing face in front of. Satisfying revenge isn't about the big reveal. It's about the slow realization that the game you thought you were winning was over before you even sat down. I had spent a lifetime building this structure, and I wasn't about to let them tear it down just because they were hungry for a harvest they didn't plant. As I left the church, I felt the weight of the last few days begin to lift. The mourning was for Arthur, but the justice was for me. I had set the boundaries, I had held the line, and I had done it all without losing my dignity. But the real consequence was still to come. On Monday, the quiet period would end, but the new reality would begin. And my children were about to find out that a mother's love has many forms. And sometimes that form is a closed door and a firm no. Saturday morning was the first time I felt the true stillness of being alone. I sat on the back porch, watching the mist rise off the grass. For 40 years, my life had been a series of reactions to other people's needs. I was the wife who supported the vision, the mother who smoothed the path, and the nurse who mended the broken. But as the sun began to burn through the fog, I realized that I was no longer a supporting character in someone else's drama. I was the author of my own conclusion. By noon, the legal reality began to solidify. Solomon Reed arrived at the house with a briefcase full of finality. We sat at the dining room table, the same table where Cassandra had tried to stage her coup just days before. Solomon didn't offer pity. He offered structure. He laid out the documents for the private holding company. The $25 million was no longer a family estate in the eyes of the law. It was a private foundation dedicated to nursing scholarships and urban redevelopment with a modest, fixed annuity for my own living expenses. I looked at the signature lines. By signing these, I wasn't just cutting people off in the way a petulant child might. I was rerouting a river. For years, Arthur and I had watched that money flow into designer handbags, luxury car leases, and gambling debts. Now it would flow into the hands of young women working double shifts in trauma wards, trying to build a life from nothing, just like I once did. This was the senior justice Arthur had whispered about. It wasn't about punishing our children. It was about honoring the struggle that created the wealth in the first place. As I signed the final page, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the frantic, rhythmic pounding of a daughter in crisis. It was a delivery. Two men in jumpsuits began unloading boxes from a truck. I had spent the previous evening quietly arranging for the lifestyle assets to be reclaimed. The silver SUV Cassandra drove, it was a company lease. The mahogany desk David coveted, it belonged to the estate. I wasn't being petty, I was being precise. If they wanted to live a life of luxury, they were free to do so on their own dime. Cassandra arrived 20 minutes later, her eyes red-rimmed and her voice hoarse. She saw the moving truck and stopped dead in her tracks. She didn't ask what was happening. She knew. She walked into the house, her heels clicking on the floor that no longer belonged to her future. She looked at Solomon, then at the papers on the table, and finally at me. For the first time in her life, she didn't lead with a demand. She asked, "Where am I supposed to go, Mama?" I looked at my daughter, the woman I had carried, the girl I had shielded. I felt a pang of the old empathy, the nurse's instinct to heal. But I suppressed it. You cannot heal a patient who refuses to acknowledge they are sick. I told her that she was 42 years old, with an Ivy League education and a consultancy firm that she claimed was world-class. I told her that she was exactly where she had positioned herself to be. I told her that the burden of the $25 million was no longer hers to worry about. I had taken her advice. I had sought protection for the assets. I just hadn't protected them for her. The silence that followed wasn't the tactical silence of a negotiation. It was the silence of a vacuum. There was nothing left to say. Marcus and David arrived shortly after, and the scene that followed was a masterclass in the geography of greed. They argued, they pleaded, and eventually they turned on each other, blaming one another for pushing me too far. They didn't realize that they hadn't pushed me. They had simply revealed that the bridge they were crossing was made of paper. I stood up and walked to the window. I didn't watch them leave. I watched the birds in the garden. I realized that setting boundaries is the most grandmother wisdom thing a woman can do. It is the gift of reality. By removing the safety net, I was finally giving them the chance to become the people they pretended to be. I wasn't bitter. I was clean. The house felt lighter. The air felt fresher. And for the first time in 48 hours, the ghost of Arthur seemed to be smiling. The structure was complete. The consequences were delivered. Now, there was only one thing left to do. Sunday morning arrived with a stillness that felt like a benediction. I woke up at 5 a.m., not because I had a shift to cover or a crisis to manage, but because my body finally belonged to me again. I walked through the house, barefoot on the cold marble, listening to the lack of noise. There were no frantic phone calls vibrating on the nightstand. There were no entitled children pacing my foyer, measuring the walls for their own portraits. The $25 million was no longer a weight on my chest or a target on my back. It was a foundation, literally and figuratively, tucked away in the hands of those who would use it to build, not to consume. I spent the morning packing a small suitcase. I wasn't leaving forever, but I was leaving for now. I had spent 45 years anchored to Arthur's vision and 24 hours a day being the emotional janitor for my children's messes. Now, the mess was cleared. The locks were changed. The quiet period had done its work, and the results were permanent. Cassandra had called one last time on Saturday night, her voice finally stripped of its arrogance. She didn't ask for a wire transfer. She asked for the name of the bankruptcy attorney Arthur used for his business acquisitions. I gave it to her. It was the only inheritance she truly needed, the name of someone who could help her navigate the ruins of her own making. Standing in the foyer, I looked at the portrait of Arthur and me on our wedding day. We looked so young, so lean, so hungry for a life we hadn't yet earned. We had worked for every inch of that $25 million. And in the end, the greatest gift Arthur gave me wasn't the money. It was the permission to be ruthless in my peace. I realized that senior justice isn't about the fire. It's about the ash. It's about what remains after the pretenders have been burned away. I felt no malice toward my children. You don't hate the wind for blowing or the rain for falling. You simply build a house that can withstand them. I had built my house. I walked out to the porch and locked the heavy oak door behind me. My car was waiting, a modest, reliable sedan I had bought with my own nursing pension, not the company fleet. I felt a surge of financial independence that had nothing to do with the millions in the foundation and everything to do with the fact that I owed no one an explanation. I am a Black woman of a certain age, and for the first time in my life, my silence is not a sacrifice. It is a sanctuary. People think that getting older means becoming a spectator in your own life. They think that once your hair turns silver and your pace slows down, you lose the ability to move the pieces on the board. They are wrong. Quiet power is the most dangerous kind because it doesn't give you a warning shot. It just arrives. I had set my boundaries. I had delivered the consequences. And I had reclaimed my dignity from the people who thought they could trade it for a higher credit limit. I am Evelyn Moore, and I am finally beautifully done. If you've ever felt like your family sees you as a bank instead of a person, or if you're tired of being told your twilight years mean you should stop standing up for yourself, remember this. The harvest belongs to those who tilled the soil, not those who showed up with a basket. You don't have to shout to be powerful. You just have to be willing to move the fence. The story doesn't end when the money is gone. It starts when the truth is all that's left. Don't let them underestimate you just because you're quiet. Hit the like button if you believe that respect is earned, not inherited, and comment silence below if you're ready to set your own boundaries today. Watch the next video to see how one grandmother handled an entitled son-in-law who tried to sell his house while he was still living in it. You won't want to miss the consequence.